mental health in Mannheim. I guess one reason why we are here today is that we're an academic partner of the ESRC Center for Society and Mental Health. And we are, of course, very grateful that the center have invited us to present our work here at this exciting conference today. So Ginny has already mentioned the Mentimeter. I'm just doing this for everyone who's just about to arrive. So please do submit your comments and also questions to the Mentimeter. You can find the link in the chat. We're very happy to answer those. So we will select probably some questions to comment on directly in a Q&A, and then also try to work our way through those via the chat as other presentations will go ahead. Now in our session, we really want to look at the interface between the social, biological, and psychological, and really want to shed some more light on how adverse social contexts and experiences impact on individuals, both at the biological and the psychological level, to shape our mental health. And I guess it has only recently become increasingly clear that we do need to look across various levels of explanation and causation, and at the interplay of social, biological, and psychological factors, how these combine and interact with each other, to understand more fully how individuals in diverse communities and settings are pushed along the continuum of mental ill health. So on the one hand, we want to improve understanding and present evidence on this interplay. And then on the other, we also want to show how we can use evidence on these basic underpinnings to then develop ecological interventions, translate this evidence to daily life out there in communities and settings, and really intervene and improve mental health. I've already mentioned that I'm co-chairing this session with Andreas, and I'm delighted to now also introduce Andreas as the first speaker to you. Andreas is psychiatrist and director of the Central Institute of Mental Health. He has a strong background in social neuroscience and a strong interest in the interface of the social environment and underlying neural mechanisms. And Andreas will now talk about social interactions and ethnic minority status, biological mechanisms underpinning risk and resilience for mental disorders. Thanks very much, Andreas, for being prepared to give this talk to us today, and I very much look forward to it. And so we can see your slides, Andreas, but I can't quite hear you yet. So maybe that's just me.
It is the usual, sorry, I didn't press the unmute button. So thank you very much, Uli. Sorry, I'm already delayed and we are under a very rigorous time regime. So let me just say I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm going to start off with some biology on risk and resilience that is really historically been seen really related mainly to social factors. And what I would like to talk about is ethnic minority status, which is known to be a very strong, in fact, the second strongest in terms of attributable risk, known environmental risk factor for schizophrenia. This is a meta-analysis. There have been more papers coming on, all of it really showing that if you are a first-generation migrant or even a second-generation migrant, your risk for schizophrenia is strongly increased by around 2.5 to 3-fold. The fact that this is so in second-generation migrants already shows you that this isn't really about pre-migratory phase or migratory stress, which second-generation migrants have never experienced, but about the situation of living in a culture, in a country that isn't quite the one that you were born into or by which your family is still characterized. So this is a facet of the post-migratory situation, and people have thought about underlying mechanisms for a long time. And one, I think, a pretty influential hypothesis posits that chronic social defeat, the fact that you continue to be in an outsider position, that you're exposed to interactions that aren't validating or even adversarial, may be underlying this risk for psychosis, because through some mechanisms this may sensitize the dopamine system. We're going to talk a little bit more about why that would make you psychotic in the coming episode. So the idea is that you have a chronic social stress situation that underpins this risk factor. we did a study to look at whether that's actually the case a few years ago that you can see here, in which we used a social stress paradigm. These paradigms, I think, are by now relatively well established, and they involve performing tasks under investigator pressure and scrutiny while imaging the brain and asking whether there are differences between a very high level, well-characterized group of healthy second-generation migrants compared to a corresponding group of German non-migrants, taking care to account for aspects such as social distance in group out-group status by having both a migrant, if you will, and a non-migrant experimenter team. And doing that, we found relatively specific hyperactivity of the social stress networks in migrants in this area of the brain that you see here in a part of the cingulate cortex that we call perigenual cingulate cortex that was hyperactive during social stress only in migrants. And it also extended into a region of the brain I'm going to talk a little bit more about that are related to dopamine. And this brain effect was strongly linked to perceived discrimination of the own ethnic group. So migrants endorse questions about ethnic discrimination to very different degrees. And to the degree that they did that, they tended to show this hyperactivity in this specific area of the social brain. Now, this is an interesting area because we know that it is crucial for the regulation of negative affect, especially amygdala signaling of negative affect. This is a very simple, in fact, in animals, even monosynaptic circuit linking the perigenual cingulate cortex to the amygdala. And in a previous work with so-called candidate genes, it's something that's become by now a little bit disreputable, but when we did this work at NIMH, it was still okay to look at these genes which impact the way in which environmental adversity increases the risk for mental health. And all of these genes that we looked at here were in the serotonergic system, and when you had the risk allele, it didn't make you ill by itself, but if that came together with early adversity, it tended to increase your risk for affective disorders especially. And we found that those genes all converge on an impact on that circuit between the cingulate and, in this case, the amygdala. So we've come to think of this area as being important for gene-environment interaction. And we could actually show that there was some indication that there was, in fact, related to chronic stress. So in a mediation analysis, we could see that the interactions between subregions of the cingulate was actually explained by chronic stress, and chronic stress mediated the impact of perceived group discrimination on this neural phenotype. So there was something of value to that idea from the area that we identified, and we were then interested to look at why would that make you psychotic. And the idea here that I think the field has converged to in recent years is that psychosis has something to do with abnormal signaling of environmental salience. So this is famous work by Wolfram Schulz from Cambridge, who used the reward paradigm to show that the brain signaled something important and unexpected in the environment. In this case, it was a food reward to an alert behaving monkey, is actually signaled by a burst of dopamine in parts of subcortical structures such as the ventral striatum and also parts of the brainstem. And in psychosis, you can show, this is a nice paper by Graham Murray and colleagues, that patients with schizophrenia have on the one hand a blunted dopaminergic response to reward, and that may underlie features such as anhedonia maybe to some degree, but more importantly, they actually show excessive signaling of salience to reward that in this paradigms are defined to be non-salient. What that means for the clinical picture is that patients with psychosis have a continuous, we think, chaotic upregulation of this dopaminergic salient signal that leads to them having something marked as salience where there's actually nothing going on. And from that point, I think, you know, classical psychopathology tells us, it's beautiful work, for example, by Conrad, classical German psychopathology on early schizophrenia, how you get from that feeling that something's going on in the environment to a full-blown delusion. So we think that that's, if you will, the final common pathway that makes it psychotic, and that together with the data that I've just shown you leads to the expectation that during social stress, migrants and refugees should show excessive dopaminergic release into those structures of the brain. And that is in fact what we found. We could contribute a little to collaborative work with Canada and also King's College, in which PET was used to show that both the synthesis of dopamine and the release of dopamine during stress is very strongly increased in immigrants. There's very different immigrants, you know, migrants in Canada or in South London, so mainly Asian or Caribbean immigrants, showing almost 3 times the dopamine release you can see here compared to what non-immigrants release. So there seems to be some value to this idea that these two things are connected. This is, sorry, this has been shifted, but it just shows you this big increase into the midbrain. And we can even show a structural impact on that brain area by migration status. So male migrants have even not just the functional abnormality that I've just shown you, but a volume reduction. And that is interesting, not just by itself, but also because this is part of a bigger picture. And you will see as the symposium goes on that other environmental risk factors, and also we're not talking about this today, but it is true, both common and genetic risk factors converge on this area of the cingulate, which we now think as a core area of risk. And the final brief point I would like to make on the biology is that you can also ask, is it also improved by resilience factors? Is it just getting worse by risk? Is also better by resilience? And that is actually the case. We just have a paper in press. I think it should be now on the webpage, or if not pretty soon, in JAMA Psychiatry, showing that if you're looking at the positive aspect of social interaction, in this case, we're using an ecological momentary assessment design that Markus Reichert will tell you more about, to look at people's well-being in the natural environment. We find that this is enhanced if people are socially interacting. And if we map to the degree to which they gain effective well-being by social interaction, we find this exact amygdala cingulate circuit here in the brain positively impacted by a resilience factor. So both from risk and resilience, we have a brain system here that we think underlies several of these observations. And that, I hope, was almost in time for the initial biological remarks. Just let me briefly thank you, the funders and the people who actually did this work, and now hand it over back to Uli for chairing a brief Q&A question.
Well, thanks, Andreas, and so perfectly on time, given we've even started with a small delay. So thanks very much. So yeah, so the paper is open for discussion, and Ginny, maybe if you're able to share the Mentimeter. I haven't seen any comments and questions coming in my end yet, but it may be me not knowing how this Mentimeter exactly works. But maybe in the meantime, I can put one question to you, Andreas, and I think you've started to, no, so there are some, so then let's take those first. So question is there any difference physiologically with migrants who have chosen willingly to go and leave their home country to another, and those who have done it to flee a stressful situation?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question, and we're looking at that currently in the context of refugees. So all the migrants I've shown you there are second-generation migrants. So there are actually there because their parents left their home country in search of usually economic opportunity. But we currently have a group of refugees who've experienced significant refugee stress, and B, have had a downward slope in social status also. And one thing that we can definitely say is that the impact of social mobility, so whether you're moving up or down the social scale, which is strongly confound whether you're a refugee or a migrant for economic opportunities, has a strong impact on that same circuit. And that is also mediated by markers of chronic stress, such as, for example, the cortisol awakening response. Now, I'm just continue if that's okay, Uli, just reading off those questions. Could you speculate how much the social defeat hypothesis might account for the greater proportion of BME individuals in secure mental health settings? Good question, but I can't, right? So I don't have any data on that. Maybe let's revisit it would be my suggestions in further questions. Are any of these effects moderate, immediate by economic status? That is an excellent question, is something I just alluding to. We are looking at socioeconomic status, so self-reported SES, which is strongly but not exclusively dominated by economic status. And there we can say that the SES really maps to that area of the cingulate. There's a great paper by Ahmad Hariri and his group 2007 showing that in brain structure, and there's a paper by my group in neuron in the same year showing this in function. And as I've just alluded to, social mobility moderates these findings in structure, but it doesn't fully explain it. It's just a significant moderation. So there's additional stuff, doesn't fully explain it, but it certainly contributes to it. And it's a really good question. And the convergence of these risk factors is something that we will revisit. And then, can I take one more? And then I'll stop.
Last one, Andreas.
Yeah.
Yes.
Has anyone done similar studies, look at migrants who are not closely connected to their home communities in the new environment, those with strong cultural community links? Not precisely in brain in that fashion, but there is a thing called the social density effect. It basically says that your risk of becoming psychotic is attenuated if you live in areas where there are more of your own ethnicity around you. We've been looking at the social density effect in our data, but we have come up negative. So we didn't see a clear indication of that in brain. Thank you very much. There are tons of more questions. I think that's awesome, but I think we should now move on to the second talk, or we will be severely punished by the organizers.
Yes, great. Thanks, Andreas. And maybe you can answer a few more questions in the chat if you get a chance. But so I'm now very pleased to introduce Markus Reichert as the next speaker. And Markus is a postdoc at the Central Institute of Mental Health in the research groups on mobile health methods, as well as systems neuroscience. And I think he's got also an affiliation with the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And this is really a link we are using a lot to improve on our mobile health methods. So this is really great. And Markus is also interested in how the social environment impacts on neurobiology and mental health. And he will talk about inner city green space exposure and non-exercise activity, neurobiological mechanisms underlying resilience for mental health in cities. Thanks very much, Markus, for being here today, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Uli, for this very kind introduction, and thanks a lot for having me here today, for the invitation. I want to present on some mechanisms underlying risk and resilience in urban areas. And this is work I was able to do in Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg's group in the last years. And first of all, I want to show why it is worthwhile to look on these data and why we should care about mental health in cities. And here is data, what we know from epidemiological studies showing that the risk for having a psychiatric disorder in cities is significantly and highly increased, so especially for schizophrenia. And there are also models trying to explain this heightened risk. And these are not trivial, but they are really not difficult to understand. And they basically show that there is just see I have to go on. And they basically show that there is kind of altered neural stress processing which interacts with genetic and epigenetic risk factors in adolescence, and in later life this may lead to an increased risk for psychiatric disorders. And as Andreas already pointed out and expanded on, there's a brain circuitry which we think that is really impacted by those factors. And this is especially boiling down to the anterior cingulate cortex, so the regulation area for motivation, emotion, and stress circuits, which has been shown to be impacted by risk and resilience factors. For example, ethnic minority status, which you just heard, but also from urban upbringing, so currently living in cities or being brought up in a city changes stress reactivity, and those stress circuits closely related to the ACC. This has also been shown for low social status in childhood. And so we have a basic understanding how the city changes our brain and changes our stress reactivity. However, what we do not know so far is which factors in everyday life really contribute to this risk and resilience. And this may be a whole range of factors. So from population density, across ethnic diversity, up to nature, environment, and physical activity. And the last two on this I want to expand in the next few minutes. And first of all, I want to give a quick overview into the urgency study, the PETS consortium at the CIMH in Mannheim, where we trying to research this everyday life factors. And to be able to do this, we kind of combine a whole range of methods, from ambulatory assessments, so electronic diaries in real life, across geoinformatics, epigenetic approaches, and of course neuroimaging to unravel the neurobiological mechanisms, and some questionnaire modules on early development and psychosocial measurements. From the ambulatory assessment side, from the ecological momentary assessment side, we use triggered e-diaries. That is, we follow participants in their everyday life as they roam across the city. And every time they approach a situation of interest, so in this example, you can see the participant approaching a green space. We use this context information in real time and ask participants how they are currently feeling and on other psychological constructs. Now, I first want to show you some data on physical activity of city dwellers in their everyday life. And we kind of refer to a study in JAMA Psychiatry from Mary Kangas and her colleagues, which was basically showing that there is a cross-system reactivity of physical activity, and especially the energy domain. So this has important implications for affective disorders, bipolar disorder, and depression. And Mary Kangas basically showed that physical activity impacted affective valence, but was especially related to the energy domain in both directions. And we kind of built upon this evidence and looked into a discovery study to first replicate the finding of a momentary association between non-exercise activity, and we especially focused on non-exercise activities such as stair climbing, as this is being conducted by participants in their everyday life and is not, you don't need to go out for 1 hour exercising, going jogging, but it's just what everybody does in his everyday life. And we could show that there is a strong momentary association with feeling energetic. And then when looking at a second sample, which in addition we acquired magnetic resonance imaging, we were happy to see that people that move more in their everyday life across 1 week also showed a higher gray matter volume in the subgenal portion of the ACC, which you can see here on the right side. And from this, we went on to see if we can find a mechanism related to this increased gray matter volume in the brain. And indeed, when comparing people with a low ACC volume, so this would be the ones shown to be susceptible to psychiatric disorders in prior studies, when those people kind of were inactive, were sedentary in their everyday life, they suffered from being inactive compared to the high SGACC individuals. So this may be kind of a risk mechanism. But on the other hand, on the right side of the figure, we also see that individuals at risk profited more if they are active in everyday life. So we have both sides of risk and resilience, which come together when looking at momentary non-exercise activity in everyday life and its impact on subjective energy being an important domain for especially affective disorder. And then the second set of data I want to introduce to you is about nature environment. So of course, we all know that cross-sectionally, nature environment has positive impacts on feelings of people and on mental disorders. However, what was for a long time unclear is how this functions in everyday life and how this mechanism works from the biological side. And therefore, we acquired data in, again, both a discovery and a replication study from city dwellers in the city of Mannheim. And we tracked them via geolocation tracking in their everyday life. So they behaved as usual, but every time they approached green spaces, we just asked them how they were feeling about their affective valence. And what we can see here is a strong main effect of urban green space exposure at the moment on affective valence. So the fixed effect across the whole sample within subjects. And we also see that this effect is robust against the set of covariates, and it differs between people. So there are some individuals that profit more than others, and also some that do not profit at all. And this we used to first look on the specificity of the effect. We saw that it was kind of a short-term effect, a very momentary one, driven by visibility and with also kind of directionality, showing us that people profited from being exposed to green space, but that increased valence did not make them roam out to search for green spaces. Then we use this random estimates, so the difference in the benefit between people, to look for brain areas associated with green space benefit. And what we can see here is that individuals that especially profit from green space in their everyday life, they do show a reduced activation in the dorsolateral part of the prefrontal cortex in an emotion regulation paradigm, so the classical Hariri task. And this kind of led us to the conclusion that urban green space could have the potential to reduce or to compensate for reduced neuroregulatory capacity in everyday life. In a last step, we backmapped this data to city maps of Mannheim, and were potentially or were quite interested where those people with a high benefit and a low reactivity in the brain roamed around most. And this was mainly in the city center of Mannheim, so in the city squares, where they are characterized by both less green space and the high incidence of psychiatric disorders. And we thought that this really comes with high implications for both public health and city planning. Yeah, and so with this, I also hope that I'm just in time, and thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take the questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Markus. You've been perfectly on time. So please all hit the magic Mentimeter with questions. while I see the questions coming in, maybe one to get us started. So what does it actually mean for practical prevention? Can we draw conclusions on what to actually do differently in cities specifically, or does this stop at the neuroscience level?
Yeah, that's a very good question, since this comes down to what Uli in the beginning said. So it's really, really important to know about the biological mechanisms and then to use this information to bring it into intervention in everyday life. And what we are currently working on is to think about interventions, so just-in-time interventions in everyday life, using apps to roam people through more or less green areas on their way to work or in their everyday life, to make use of this resilience. And this can be done not only by planting trees and increasing green spaces in cities, but also by ecological momentary interventions in everyday life.
Thank you very much. Let me see. I think there's one question in the Mentimeter, but it seems to be on the migrant question. So let me just briefly take it. There is the question, would there be any different if the case is migrating from developing countries to developed countries? And would there be any specific time period, how long it would last? So the first one is, we don't have data on this, but the epidemiological data in our regions actually don't support a very strong effect of whether you move from developed to developing and vice versa. And it does seem that the relevant time period is early, so from intrauterine to the first years of lives. Now we have two questions coming in for you, Markus. The first is it different in people with mood disorders? We've been studying healthy controls, so that's the question.
That's a good question. So indeed, we have been studying community-based samples. So we have the whole spectrum of people in there. What we saw in the study from Mary Kangas et al. Is that indeed in bipolar patients, this effect of physical activity on cross-system reactivity was enhanced. And there are really only few studies out there with ecological momentary assessment studying, for example, physical activity and mood in patients. And what we can see there is, I find it quite interesting, namely that it's very heterogeneous. So some of the patients profit a lot from physical activity as a resilience factors. Others do not at all. They may also have a negative effect. This will be a topic for the future to use really those methods in patient populations and having a closer look.
Perfect. Maybe one very brief last question, brief answer. Does weather impact findings from benefit around green spaces?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this interesting question. We indeed took this as a covariate, and this didn't impact our findings. But what we saw is that one indicator of weather, and this was air pressure, really had some direct effects on current effective valence. So a higher pressure was associated with better effective valence.
Good. So global warming may have some effects yet. There are tons of cool questions coming in, maybe a little later. I will now hand over to you, Uli, to introduce Christian. And thank you, Markus, for a really good presentation.
Thanks, Andreas. And I think so. So I'm very pleased to introduce now actually Leonie from.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
So we swapped. So yeah. Leonie is an early career researcher in the Department of Public Mental Health here at the CIMH. And I'm very pleased that she joined us today to give a talk about affective recovery from minor adversities in daily life that we think might be a protective mechanism. And she's looking at this across clinical stages of mental disorder. Thanks very much, Leonie, for being prepared to give this talk today, and very much looking forward to it now.
Yes, thank you very much, Uli, for the kind introduction. I would like to talk about the concept of affective recovery as one potential momentary mechanism. So let me first give you a brief overview of my talk. It's well known that adversities have a high prevalence across a range of mental disorders. And I would like to talk about the concept of behavioral sensitization, which will demonstrate why in our research we do not only focus on the major adversities in life, but investigate those momentary mechanisms that play a role in mental disorders. And I will then introduce the concept of affective recovery that we've been investigating in 2 studies that I will present. So here you can see one study that is only one example of many to report a higher prevalence of childhood trauma as one type of adversity in patients with different mental disorders. So how can we explain this link between adversities and mental disorders? Well, one approach is that there's one common underlying mechanism, and one mechanism that has repeatedly been proposed to play a role, especially in psychosis, is behavioral sensitization. And the idea here is that severe or repeated exposure to major adversity in life amplifies an individual's response even to minor stressors in daily life. In other words, individuals who are exposed to adversities gradually develop a greater sensitivity to stress. So looking at the graph on the left, we can see the development of symptom severity over the course of time in 3 cases with different exposures to adversities. And in person C, for example, they experienced severe or repeated adversities. And on the right, we can see the amplitude of the stress response progressively increases over time with each adversity. And this in turn leads to persistence of psychotic symptoms and can result in transition to, in this case, psychotic disorder. So in this model, we can see how previous exposure to severe stress increases the sensitivity to small stressors in daily life. And in the research I'm presenting to you today, we zoom into this micro level and look at the momentary minor stressors in daily life, represented by this red arrow here. So at the scale of 1 day, negative affect will likely increase after a stressor and then gradually decrease again due to the different levels of sensitivity in A, B, and C. We might expect this emotional reaction to the stressor to differ in intensity and duration. So one of these mechanisms that has been mentioned before has been studied a lot, and that's stress reactivity. So the increase of negative affect following a stressor. But we would also like to study mechanisms that work against these adversities and protect us from the lasting effects of adversities. So stress resilience. Let me give you a definition of stress resilience. Connor and Davidson define stress resilience as the ability to recover from and overcome the effects of significant adversity. And we're now asking ourselves, is it also the ability to recover from and overcome the effects of minor adversities or daily stressors? So we're looking at this time frame when affect returns back to the level before the stressor occurred. And that's what we call affective recovery. So there's the first study that investigated affective recovery in daily life. And the study compared individuals with early psychosis to individuals with chronic psychosis and healthy controls. And I will not go into detail with the results here, but the main finding was that there was evidence that affective recovery differed between these groups. And building on these findings, we conducted 2 studies while making 2 changes to the approach. So first of all, when talking about potentially protective mechanisms, it's very important to not only study negative affect, but positive affect as well, as it's been suggested to be an important part of resilience. And that's what we did in the first study. So we looked at positive affective recovery in psychosis, comparing groups with different severities of psychotic symptoms. And these underlying mechanisms do not seem to be disorder specific, which is why we then expanded the approach to a transdiagnostic population in study 2. Again, comparing groups with different severities or different levels of progression of different disorders. And we also used the experience sampling method or ecological momentary assessment. And in our studies, the participants answered 10 questionnaires per day at random time points during their daily life. And they were asked questions on positive affect and on minor stressors. So for example, they were asked to think about the most important event that happened to them since the last signal. And whenever they said the event was unpleasant, that was considered as stress. And for our analyses, we defined the first time point of a day when participants reported a stressor, which we called T0. And this means the stressor happened somewhere in between these two time points. And the time points after marked the recovery period. And as we were interested in how long it would take the participants to return to their level of positive affect before the stressor happened, we used the time point before, so T-1, as the reference or the baseline value. Now, please keep in mind this timeline when we look at the results now. And since we're looking at positive affect now, the trajectories are flipped around, so positive affect decreases after stress. And what we found in study 1 was that all groups showed a significant decrease of positive affect after the stressor. And looking at the recovery, healthy controls and individuals with the first episode of psychosis were already recovered one time point later, so back to their baseline level. But individuals with an at-risk mental state still had significantly lower positive affect for 3 more time points after the stressor compared to the baseline. And keeping in mind these time points were about 90 minutes apart, they had a recovery period of about 4.5 hours. Also, the groups differed in baseline levels of positive affect, so positive affect without any stressor, but there was no evidence for differences between the groups in their recovery duration. So on to study 2, where we looked at the transdiagnostic groups. We can see a similar pattern. So all groups differed at baseline. And again, we found that all groups showed a significant decrease in positive affect following the stressor. And for individuals with a severe mental disorder, so in this case, psychosis or depression, and at-risk individuals, it took 1 more time point to recover to baseline levels. And healthy control participants returned to baseline once at T1, so quicker than the other groups. But there was then a significant difference to baseline again, leaving us with kind of mixed results regarding their recovery duration. But again, we found no difference between the groups regarding effective recovery. But we had another interesting finding from exploratory analyses. So the first stressor of a day does not have to be the only one. So more stressors might have occurred at the following time points. And when we controlled for these subsequent stressors, the recovery period disappeared in all groups, meaning that all groups directly returned to baseline after this initial stress reactivity. Okay, so what have we learned from our studies on effective recovery so far? We found first evidence that different clinical groups with different symptom levels or risks for disorders show different trajectories of positive affect following these minor daily stressors. And in our analysis, in the last analysis, we found that reporting more than one stressor in a row actually seems to drive this effect. So that's something to look into further. We have some limitations that we should keep in mind too. So first of all, the way we measure stress is not perfect. There are some methodological considerations, and that's something we'd like to optimize in the future. And also, especially in the second study, we grouped participants according to clinical staging models, and this is theoretically backed up well, but actually still needs validation for clinical practice. So the way we define our comparison groups might still be improved. So as I showed you in the beginning, we zoomed into this micro level of daily life, but in the next step, zooming out again and taking these prior exposures to major adversity into account, may help us clarify the role of affective recovery as a potential protective mechanism. And then on a more applied level, once we've learned more about it, affective recovery may become a potential target mechanism for interventions in the future. Yes, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Leonie. It's a great talk. Unfortunately, we're a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to restrict us to the question that's currently in your Menti. Do you have any data on use of antipsychotics as stressors by causing discomfort, for example, akathisia or tardive dyskinesia?
So actually, the data we have was from previous studies. So we don't have all these covariates, so we don't actually know yet, and we're quite early in these analyses. But that's actually, yeah, a very interesting question to keep in mind.
Yeah, and maybe since this was short, just one brief last one from the previous Menti, which I think is for you. Have you used sensory processing sensitivity, HSP, Elaine Aron's work, as well as mental illness to explain differences?
So that's a very interesting question. As I said, we're very early in these analyses, so actually no.
Yeah, it's maybe a very good idea to do that in the future, right? Okay, and now the questions are coming in, but we need to move on, right? The inexorable current of time, and I'll again hand over to Uli.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andreas. And so I'm pleased to now introduce Christian Rauschenberg, who wants to once again talk a little bit more about potential protective mechanisms in daily life, but also on how we can use this as avenues for system-level prevention. Christian is a postdoc as well in our department, or just about to press to submit actually on his thesis, on his PhD thesis, not quite postdoc yet. I already think of him as such. But yeah, so Christian will talk about our living lab on mental health promotion and system-level prevention. Christian, very much looking forward to your talk.
All right, thank you very much, Uli, and for your kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today and to have the opportunity to present my work or our work. And my presentation is entitled Psychological Mechanism Linking Adversity in Mental Health Induced New Avenues for System-Level Prevention. So a lot of the things I'm going to tell you at the beginning of the presentation is quite some repetition, but I think it's always okay also to repeat sometimes content. So as you have already heard in previous presentations, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are highly stressful events that occur early in life and are potentially traumatic. They may occur as a single event, for instance, a severe car accident, or as prolonged threats like bullying, victimization in school context. But in any case, exposure to adversity requires significant adaptation on a social, emotional, and neurobiological level. And there has been quite some extensive research over the recent years and robustly showing that ACEs are associated with a range of mental health conditions, including psychosis, depression, anxiety, and many others. And they also turn out to be non-specifically associated with mental health outcomes. And there always seems to be a dose-response relationship and also cumulative effect. So it makes a difference whether someone is exposed to only one exposure type or to many. So it's unfortunately also the case that these experiences are quite common in the society. For instance, when it comes to bullying victimization, the estimated lifetime prevalence is around 30% depending on the country. So, but why is it actually the case that some people go on and develop mental health problems and others don't? So for this, we really have to think about candidate or underlying mechanism. And when we look on the re-aim of youth mental health, we do not know that much about it actually. But what we can argue is that it's quite unlikely that the various types of ACEs are linked to as many different mechanisms. So they're probably shared mechanism, as Leonie already said in the previous talk. And one such mechanism is behavioral sensitization, where the idea is that there's a progressive amplification over time when people are exposed to traumatic events. So there are many ways to study these kind of ideas. And one way is to use, again, the experience sampling method or ecological momentary assessment, where we which allows us to assess subjective experiences, symptoms, and minor stressful events in the flow of daily life with high ecological validity. For this, for instance, in the most widely used sampling scheme, individuals are asked 10 times a day for 6 consecutive days how they are feeling in their everyday life through short questionnaire. And when we do that, we see a lot of variance in the variables. So this is great about the ESM method, that we see that all the things we're actually assessing are differing quite a lot in everyday life. But coming back to stress sensitivity, what we can do, we can use this variable to see whether there is an association between momentary stressors, for instance, social stress. If someone is in company, for instance, and does not like this company, this would be defined as a minor social stressor, and associated to the negative affect support experiences, so mental health outcomes in everyday life. And this may quantify the individual stress sensitivity. And to investigate whether adverse childhood experiences may be affecting stress sensitivity, we can see whether this association is modified by exposure to adverse childhood experiences. And we did this in quite a bit of studies over the recent years. And I just want to show you one example today when it comes to bullying victimization. So as I said before, we used the experience sampling study and included young individuals between 15 to 20 years. And some of them were service users and secondary mental health services, others were siblings and controls. And we looked on the association between momentary stress and negative affect, so what you saw in the previous slide. And we looked whether the stress sensitivity, so the strength of the association, differed by the levels of exposure. And you see that if someone were exposed to high levels of bullying victimization, that the slope, so the association, was higher as compared to someone who were exposed to low levels of bullying victimization. And this is something we found in various studies, also when it comes to negative life events and childhood trauma like abuse and neglect and others. Looking on the control group, we see that there are more inconsistent findings. So we often saw that there is no effect moderation by levels of exposure. But in some cases, like here, what I show you here, the effect on bullying victimization was actually shifted, so that those who were exposed to high levels of bullying victimization had a lower stress sensitivity as compared to those with high levels. So here, if you compare high versus low, it's a negative coefficient. So that's quite interesting. And together, this data gives us some evidence that stress sensitivity may be a candidate mechanism linking adversity and mental health outcomes in young people, and maybe even also a resilience mechanism. And we did a lot of other studies and other types of mechanism in daily life, for instance, affective recovery, what Leonie was talking about before, cognitive biases in daily life, how they're impacting mental health, threat anticipation, aberrant salience processes. And we do that because we think there may be innovative ways to really intervene in daily life to lower the likelihood that people go on to develop mental health disorders. So we try to stop potential illness trajectories at the developmental early stage. And one way to potentially do this is to use the ecological momentary intervention approach. So this is kind of using an mHealth app on the smartphone to deliver intervention components in the flow of daily life. And the basic idea of this ecological momentary interventions is, and also of experience sampling methodology, is that all experiences we are all experiencing every day are situated in the context and are also best modifiable in the context itself. And this allows us to target candidate mechanism we have just discussed. So EMIs target momentary mechanism, but also the outcomes themselves. And one example would be, for instance, if someone is experiencing a minor stressor in daily life, that then a certain breathing exercise or positive image exercise or certain compassion focus exercise is offered, that this individual potentially feels less stress in this moment. So this may be potentially give us new avenues for disciplinary prevention, right? Because all of us are having the smartphone always with us every day and every time, in school, at home, when you commute to work or school, in other contexts, we always have our smartphone with us. And when we actually ask young people what they think about the idea to use mHealth apps for mental health promotion and prevention, they really like it. So they agree or strongly agree on the question whether they can imagine using mHealth apps. And this was a representative study we have just conducted recently, asking young people between 16 to 25 years. So in short, there is subjective need and objective demand for digital interventions. And we also found that young people are already using mHealth apps in their everyday life because they download apps from the App Store and they are mostly not evidence-based, unfortunately. So there's room for improvement in this area. And 75% of young individuals do already have mHealth apps installed on their smartphone, for instance, to track their sleep, to be more active, to be more mindful, and so on and so forth. And we also found in this study that there was an association between psychological distress and the willingness to use mHealth apps. So there's also like an objective need, like I said before. So trying to get everything together, like the different lines of research, we have recently set up a living lab for system level prevention and promotion in youth, where we try to integrate all the different areas of research, like I said. And the overarching aim is to the novel application of methods of artificial intelligence to the development of a personalized digital health training for young people. And I really like this concept of living labs because they really give us opportunity to step out of this ivory tower of doing research and involve relevant stakeholders at a very early stage, and also the users at a very early stage. And to this end, we have included mental health promotion and prevention stakeholders, which are involved in the routine practice of mental health promotion, mental health illness prevention, members from the target population. So in this case, the youth council of our state in Germany, the digital industry, movie fans, and we are by ourselves also interdisciplinary research group. And we are all sitting together in the steering group to discuss all these topics. And we do not only have research aims, like in most research projects, we also have practice aims and educational aims. And in the research aims, as I said before, we try to develop an AI-based mHealth app, which is focusing on emotional resilience and other protective factors. But we also try to always appraise what we have already developed does really make sense by always asking the young people and the stakeholders whether it makes sense, and have an iterative process of making this app better over time. So we're going to have 3 different versions over a period of 3 years. We also have a practice aims, where we seek to initiate the sustainable transformation of service provision, so that we not only do this program and then after 3 years it's gone, that we also try to find sustainable change, so that we also try to bring this app actually into practice, and to strengthen also the collaboration with the stakeholders and empower them to really use new tools as an additive to what they are already offering. And we have also educational aims. We want to talk with young people about the idea of digitization, about AI algorithms to demystify the whole concept of AI, but also to strengthen mental health literacy. So to really think about and talk about important determinants of mental health outcomes, and also what kind of service provisions are out there. So it's not only psychotherapeutic practice, right? There are also already a lot of different areas where you can seek help in the society. So this is a really exciting project. And like I said, it just started. We have already had a preparatory phase, and now we go on in this 3-year period to develop this app. So I'm really excited about that. So thank you very much to all my colleagues and co-workers and the funders of this project, and of course you for your attention. And I hope it's more or less in time.
Thanks very much, Christian. So your talk was on time. We are a bit short on time due to an earlier delay, but this is perfectly fine. We still have some minutes for questions and answers, and I've seen some coming in on the Mentimeter already. So one is an app or a phone line enough to enhance the measure and create an intervention? How can schools add this up to their solutions? So maybe you can.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we're also pondering about this quite a lot recently. So in the school context, for instance, it may be helpful for the school psychologists in school to for instance, offer a certain app in addition to what they are already offering. But it may also be like independent from official ways for mental health promotion or prevention, may also be just offered, right? So just kind of circulated in school that there's a certain app they can use and have it disintegrated from the school context, because there are also always some potentially downsides to just offering it in schools.
Thanks, Christian. And so what impact does the social media have on young people on their mental health? That's another question which has come in the Mentimeter.
Yeah, I think that's also a really important question. I think there are all sorts of studies showing quite inconsistent findings, and there are, of course, a problem of confounding in this area. But I think it's really important to keep that in mind, right? The mHealth apps are not the holy grail and will solve the whole issues of mental health problems in society. So we really have to think about carefully how can we use these apps. And we had like a focus groups with young people, and we're also using our participatory tools like a website. And what we see quite often is that people ask for like ways of decreasing the use of social media by using an app. For instance, you could potentially just type, now I don't want to use the app anymore, and then the whole smartphone shuts down for 2 hours and ask you to go into nature and other contexts, for instance. So I think there is an association, and there's increasing accumulating evidence that their social media have a negative effect on mental health, and we have to take it very seriously in this whole process of developing also an mHealth app.
Thanks, Christian. So I think one very last question we can take, and then we need to come to a close. And that would be, do you see potential for this type of platform to encourage empathy and solidarity in the general public, for example, to prevent bullying?
That's a good question. I think it may be part of this whole story. Yeah. So an mHealth app may, of course, inform about the effects of bullying. Like I said before, also in our educational aims, we're going to be talking about these determinants of poor mental health. But it probably has to be integrated in the school context in a way of a school program, where the app is just one part of a bigger program, or maybe like a more societal-wide way of campaign against bullying. So there are probably ways to inform people, but I think it's difficult to really change behavior.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christian. Andreas, would you like to? So I'd like to leave. So I feel like we've gone through a lot within just an hour, and I also know there will be a hard stop. So I'm a bit worried we might be cut off in the next seconds. But so maybe to sum this up, yeah, I'd like to leave the final comments to you.
Thank you very much. So it's been a bit rushed, but I hope it's given you an idea of how you can really go from biology to psychology to interventions, from neurons, if you will, to societal risk and resilience. And one big hope of really, our side and also work in the context of the center is to bridge this gap ever better. And one thing that we really would like to achieve is to really move from a basic science insight to a targeted prevention in the interest of service users. And we've hopefully given you some ideas about that, and we were glad to be included in the symposium. Thank you very much, and for indulging us for, boy, what must be like 100 seconds over time.